The wind began to scream before the sun went down. Out where the road turned from gravel to white and the pine trees stood like dark church spires against the sky, storms did not ask for permission. They came hard and fast, and if a person was not ready, winter would remind them who truly owned the land. Folks around here said you could measure a life by the wood you stacked and the roof you trusted. On that small stretch of frozen earth, one woman had learned both lessons the hard way. Long before the -20 degrees Fahrenheit blizzard made the news, before neighbors called it the worst cold snap in 20 years, she had been in her yard with a hammer, a handful of bent nails, and $7 in her coat pocket. People laughed when they first saw it. It sat just off the side of her cabin, near the split-rail fence and beneath a sky that never seemed to stop shedding snow. It was nothing more than a rough firewood bunker built from scrapboards, a piece of old tin roofing, and a door she found leaning against the back of the feed store. The lumber had been pulled from a fallen shed. The hinges were rusted. The roof sloped low, so the snow would slide off instead of piling up. The whole thing cost her $7 in screws and weather stripping. $7 for peace of mind. Out here, firewood was not a hobby. It was not decoration stacked neatly for a photograph. It was heat. It was safety. It was the thin line between comfort and danger when winter came early or stayed too long. A wood stove could warm a room, but only if the wood feeding it stayed dry. Wet logs hissed and smoked. They wasted heat. They filled a cabin with a damp smell that crawled into blankets and bones. She knew that better than anyone. The first winter she spent alone in that cabin, she stacked her split logs under a tarp tied down with bricks. She thought it would be enough, but snow found its way under the edges. Rain seeped through seams. By January, the woodpile was heavy with moisture. She would carry armfuls inside, hoping the stove's heat would dry them enough to burn. Some nights the fire struggled to stay alive. The stove clanked and sighed. The walls felt thin. She did not like the way that felt. So, in early fall, while the leaves were still holding to the trees and the air only hinted at frost, she started building. She measured nothing twice. She worked with what she had. The bunker was small, just large enough to hold a winter's worth of split firewood if stacked tight. She raised it a few inches off the ground with leftover cinder blocks to keep moisture from creeping up from the soil. She nailed the boards close together and lined the inside with a scrap of plastic she found in the barn. The tin roof hung over the edges by a few inches to push rain away from the walls. When she shut the door for the first time, she felt a quiet pride. It was not pretty. The boards did not match. One corner leaned slightly. But when the first heavy rain of October fell, she opened the door and ran her hand over the stacked logs. Dry. When the first snowfall dusted the yard, she checked again. Dry. Neighbors still teased her. "You could have just bought a metal shed," one man said at the general store. "With what money?" She replied, smiling but not joking. $7 was what she had. $7 was what she used. By December, the firewood bunker was filled from floor to ceiling. Each log was split by hand. Each stack was tight and careful, bark side down. The door shut snug against the weather stripping. Snow began to gather along the roof, but it slid off in soft sheets. She brushed the hinges clean every few days and kept a small shovel leaning against the side. Then the forecast changed. The radio crackled with warnings of an Arctic front pushing south. Temperatures would drop fast. Winds would rise. Travel would not be advised. Folks were told to check pipes, stock food, and keep emergency heat ready. The word blizzard was spoken more than once. She had seen storms before. But something in the tone of that weather report felt different. The day before it hit, the sky turned the color of dull steel. The air felt tight and sharp in her lungs. She carried in extra water. She checked the stovepipe and cleared ash from the firebox. She opened the bunker one more time and looked at the neat wall of firewood inside. Each piece looked solid and clean. She closed the door firmly and slid the latch in place. That night the wind arrived like a freight train. It roared down from the hills, bending tree branches and driving snow sideways across the yard. The temperature dropped past 0 before midnight and kept falling. The cabin creaked and shifted as the cold tightened its grip. She fed the wood stove every few hours, grateful for the steady heat rolling off the cast iron. By morning, The world outside had vanished into white. Snow piled against the windows. The fence posts were nearly buried. The path to the bunker was gone. She opened the door and felt the wind slam into her chest. It burned her face in seconds. The thermometer nailed to the porch read -18 degrees Fahrenheit and still falling. The power lines that ran along the road sagged low and then disappeared into the storm. By noon, the lights flickered once and went out for good. Silence followed, broken only by the howl of the wind. Inside the cabin, the wood stove became everything. It cooked her food, it heated her water, it kept the cold from pushing in too close, but wood burned faster in deep cold. The fire needed constant feeding. By the second day, the drifts were waist-high. She pulled on her thick coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and stepped into the storm. The cold bit through her gloves as she pushed a path toward the bunker with a shovel. Each step felt heavy. Snow blew back into the trench as fast as she cleared it. When she reached the door, ice had formed along the edges. The wind tried to rip it from her hands as she pulled it open. Inside, the firewood waited, dry, solid, ready. She grabbed an armful and hurried back to the cabin. The stove swallowed the logs eagerly, flames rising strong and bright. The heat held steady. She went back for more, carving a deeper path with each trip. The bunker stood firm against the wind, its tin roof shedding snow just as she had hoped. Day 3 came colder than the last. The thermometer dipped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The radio batteries were weak, but she caught fragments of reports. Roads closed. Plows stalled, a few homes lost heat when propane lines froze. Emergency crews could not reach everyone. She looked at the wood stacked by the stove and then at the shrinking wall inside the bunker. She counted in her head. If she was careful, if she fed the fire steady and not wild, she would have enough. Outside, the wind changed direction. It began to drive snow straight against the side of the bunker, packing it hard against the door. She noticed the shift late that afternoon when she stepped out again. The drift against the bunker was higher than before, pressing heavy against the wood. She brushed it away as best she could, but the wind filled it back in. That night, a new sound joined the storm. A dull thud, then another. She sat upright in her chair by the stove, listening. The cabin groaned as it always did in cold weather, but this was different. It came from outside, near the side yard. Thud. Her mind went straight to the bunker. If the door gave way under the weight of snow, if wind forced its way inside, the dry firewood she depended on could be buried or soaked in ice. Without it, the stove would die within hours. The cabin would grow cold fast in -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Pipes would freeze. Breath would hang thick in the air. She pulled on her boots without thinking. The wind nearly knocked her sideways when she opened the door. Snow swirled in blinding sheets. She forced her way toward the bunker, leaning into the gale. Another thud sounded, louder now. When she reached it, her heart dropped. The drift had grown taller than the door. The pressure bowed the wood inward slightly. Ice crusted along the seams. She placed her gloved hand against the door and felt it tremble under the force of the wind. She dug with all her strength, tossing snow aside, trying to relieve the weight. The cold burned through her coat and into her shoulders. Each breath felt sharp as glass. Then the hinge made a sharp cracking sound. She froze. The wind howled around her, fierce and steady. The bunker door shuddered again, bending under the strain. Inside that small structure lay the last defense against the storm. The last of the dry firewood, the heat that kept her alive. Another crack split through the air. And the door shifted. And the door shifted. Not wide open, not torn free, just enough to make her stomach drop. The top hinge groaned under the weight of packed snow, and a thin line of powder pushed through the seam like flour squeezed from a sack. She pressed both hands against the wood, bracing it with her shoulder. The wind shoved back, cold and merciless. For a second she pictured the whole thing splitting apart, her carefully stacked firewood spilling into the drift and disappearing under ice. She leaned her weight into it and held steady. The bunker had never been meant to fight a blizzard like this. It was built from scrapboards and hope. $7 and stubbornness. She had known that when she drove the last screw into the tin roof, She had known it when neighbors shook their heads and said winter would test it. Now winter was testing everything. She forced herself to breathe slow and steady. Panic would waste energy. Panic would make her careless. The wind howled across the yard, but beneath it she could hear something else, a low creak, wood straining against wood. The drift had turned solid, heavy as stone. It pressed hard against the door, bowing it inward. She grabbed her shovel and hacked at the drift, carving away the weight bit by bit. Each scoop felt heavier than the last. Snow blew back into her face, stinging her eyes. Her gloves were stiff with ice. The scarf around her mouth was damp from her breath and freezing fast. Another cracking sound shot through the hinge. She thought about the first winter again, about the tarp-covered woodpile that soaked through and nearly left her shivering through January nights. Back then she had relied on luck and cheap shortcuts. This bunker had been her answer to that fear, raised off the ground, sloped roof, weather stripping, careful stacking to allow airflow. It was simple but smart. She had read about dry firewood storage in an old farming magazine from the library in town. The article said seasoned wood must stay protected from moisture to burn hot and clean. It talked about airflow, roof overhang, and keeping wood off frozen soil. She followed that advice as best she could with what she had. Now she wondered if she had done enough. The hinge gave another sharp snap. This time it did not break, but it shifted out of line. The door sagged slightly on one side. A thin wedge of white pushed through near the bottom. If the door opened even a few inches, the wind would fill the bunker in minutes. Snow would bury the dry logs. Even if she dug them out later, they would be crusted with ice, soaked deep. A wood stove fed with frozen firewood burns weak and smoky. In -20 degrees Fahrenheit, weak heat is no heat at all. She dug harder. Her arms burned. Her back ached. The cold clawed at her fingers. She cleared a narrow trench along the front of the bunker, enough to take some pressure off the door. The wind roared louder, as if angry at her defiance. She pressed her palm against the wood again. It still trembled, but not as violently. The drift was still high, but at least the weight had eased a little. The sky was already darkening. In a storm like this, daylight meant nothing. The world stayed gray and endless. She knew she could not stand out there much longer. The cabin needed tending. The stove needed feeding. Reluctantly, she turned back toward the house, marking the path in her mind. Each step back felt uncertain. The storm erased her footprints as soon as she made them. Inside, the heat from the wood stove wrapped around her like a blanket. She shut the door tight and leaned against it, letting her breathing settle. The small room glowed in firelight. Shadows danced along the walls. The kettle on top of the stove rattled softly. She added 2 logs from the stack she had carried in earlier. They caught quickly, flames steady and strong. Dry wood makes a clean sound when it burns, a sharp crackle that speaks of stored sunlight and long summer days. She had split those logs in August heat, sweat running down her back. Now they gave that heat back to her. But she could not shake the image of the bunker door bowing under snow. She had come to this place for quiet and independence. After years of working long hours in town, saving what little she could, she bought the small cabin and a few acres of land. It was not much. A single room with a loft, a hand pump at the well, a wood stove for heat. But it was hers. She planted a small garden in summer. She canned vegetables for winter. She cut and split her own firewood. Some called it stubborn pride. She called it living simple. Still, living simple does not mean living easy. The first months alone had been a test of patience. Fixing leaks in the roof. Learning how to keep mice out of the pantry. Stacking firewood properly so air could move through it and season it before the cold came. She made mistakes. She learned. The firewood bunker had been one of those lessons. Protect your heat source. Keep it dry. Prepare before the storm, not during it. She stirred the coals in the stove and glanced at the small stack of wood inside. It would last through the night if she was careful. But if the bunker door failed, if the drift collapsed inward, she would lose the rest. Another thud carried faintly through the walls. She looked up. The sound was muffled now, but it was there. Not as sharp as before, more like a steady push, wind driving snow. Wood under strain. She paced the room, listening. The lantern on the table flickered softly. Outside, the storm showed no sign of easing. The radio had gone silent an hour ago when the batteries died completely. She was cut off from town, from news, from help. She thought about the nearest neighbor, a half-mile down the road. In good weather, it was an easy walk. In this blizzard, it might as well be 50 miles. No plow would reach them soon. No truck could make it through drifts this deep. She was on her own. She sat back down by the stove and pulled her coat closer around her shoulders. The fire cracked steady, but the air near the windows felt colder now. She pressed her hand to the glass. Frost had crept inward along the edges. The wind shifted again, hitting the side of the cabin where the bunker stood. The wall rattled lightly. She imagined the snow piling higher, pressing harder. Her mind went back to the day she finished building it. She had stepped back and studied her work. The bunker stood square enough, the roof slanted just right. She had sealed the seams with leftover caulk. It had survived rainstorms and early snowfalls without trouble. She had even checked inside after a week of steady sleet. The firewood stayed bone dry, not a hint of dampness. She trusted it, but trust is easy in calm weather. Another creak sounded, louder this time. She could not tell if it came from the cabin or the bunker. The uncertainty gnawed at her. She stood again, restless. Waiting would not strengthen a hinge. Waiting would not hold back a drift. She needed to see it. She pulled on her boots once more, wrapped fresh cloth around her face, and opened the door into the white roar. The wind hit harder than before. Snow lashed sideways, driven sharp as sand. The path she had cleared earlier was nearly gone. She fought her way forward, step by step, using the shovel like a staff to keep balance. When the bunker came into view, her chest tightened. The drift had climbed even higher. It now reached the midpoint of the door, packed dense and solid. The top hinge hung at a slight angle, one screw partially pulled from the wood. The door bulged inward more than before. She moved closer, heart pounding. The seam along the side had widened just enough to let a thin stream of snow push inside, not much yet. Just a small line along the edge. But in a storm like this, small weaknesses grow fast. She set the shovel down and pressed both hands flat against the door. The wood felt icy and rigid. She could feel the vibration of wind through it. She imagined the stack of firewood inside, still dry for now, waiting. If she could reinforce the hinge, maybe it would hold. But she had no spare hardware outside. All her tools were in the cabin. And even if she brought them, working with bare screws in this cold would be near impossible. Metal freezes skin in seconds. Another deep gust slammed against her, nearly knocking her to her knees. The bunker shuddered. A fresh crack echoed, sharp and final. She saw the top hinge bend farther out, the wood around the screw splintering. For a brief second, everything seemed to pause. The wind held its breath. The world narrowed to that single point where wood met metal. Then the door jerked again, shifting another inch inward. And she knew the next gust might be the one that tears it open. She did not wait to see if it would. Instead, she threw her weight against the door from the outside, pressing it back into place as the wind roared in protest. Snow whipped around her boots, packing tight against her legs. Her shoulder burned from the pressure. The bunker trembled like a living thing, caught between holding and giving way. For a moment she considered opening it fully and pulling as much dry firewood out as she could, stacking it inside the cabin while she still had the chance. But if she opened that door now, even an inch too wide, the wind would fill the bunker with snow in seconds. The firewood would be buried and soaked before she could blink. She pressed harder. The storm did not care about her plans or her $7 project. It did not care about airflow design or raised platforms or careful stacking. The blizzard only knew how to push, to freeze, to test every weak spot. Her thoughts began to scatter in the cold. She forced herself to focus, think steady, think smart. She stepped back just enough to study the hinge. The top screw had nearly pulled free from the wood frame. The bottom hinge still held, but it groaned under the weight. The weather stripping she had nailed around the doorframe flapped loose at one corner, letting fine snow slip through the seam. If the top hinge gave out, the door would twist. Once twisted, the lower hinge would not last long. She looked around the yard through the swirling white. Everything was buried. The fence posts were small humps. The woodpile she had once covered with tarp was invisible under drifts. The world had narrowed to this one struggle between her and the door. Her mind drifted back to the man at the general store who had laughed at her bunker idea. "You need something stronger than that," he had said, leaning on the counter. "Winter around here is no joke." She had nodded politely. She knew winter was no joke. She had grown up in it. But she also knew money did not grow on trees, not even pine trees. And metal shed cost more than she had saved that season. And hauling one out to her property would have meant borrowing a truck and asking for help she did not want to owe. So she built what she could. Now she wondered if pride had shaped the bunker as much as necessity. Another gust slammed into her, and this time the door bowed so far inward she heard the stacked firewood shift inside. A dull rumble came from within, logs settling against each other. Her chest tightened. If the stack collapsed, it might push the door open from the inside. She had packed it tight to maximize space, stacking each split log carefully so they locked together. That tight stacking had kept the wood dry and stable through earlier storms. But under pressure from both snow and wind, the balance could fail. She stepped away from the door and began shoveling again, carving deeper along the base and sides, trying to relieve pressure. Her movements were slower now. The cold had seeped into her muscles. Her breath came sharp and shallow. As she worked, another worry crept in. The cabin itself. She had been so focused on the firewood bunker that she had not thought about the roof of the cabin. Snow was piling high everywhere. The tin roof could handle weight, but only to a point. If ice built up along the edges and blocked the melt, the load could grow dangerous. She glanced toward the cabin through the white blur. Snow clung thick to the roofline. Icicles had begun to form along the eaves, frozen solid in the deep cold. If she lost the bunker and the cabin roof failed, she would have nowhere warm to retreat. The thought hit her hard. Living alone had always been her choice. She had valued the quiet, the self-reliance. But in moments like this, the silence felt heavier. There was no one to trade shifts with, no one to say, "I'll hold the door while you fix the hinge." The responsibility rested entirely on her shoulders. She dug until her arms shook. Finally, she stepped back again, chest heaving. The drift was lower along one side now, but the wind continued to push fresh snow into the space she cleared. It felt like trying to empty a river with a bucket. Another crack echoed louder than before. The top hinge jerked, and one screw tore free completely, spinning into the snow at her feet. The hinge plate twisted sideways, hanging by a single screw. The door sagged sharply. She lunged forward and braced it again, heart pounding in her ears. The seam widened, and a spray of powder shot inside. "No," she muttered through frozen lips, though the storm swallowed the word. She shifted her weight, trying to hold the door flush against the frame. The lower hinge screeched in protest. The weather stripping tore loose entirely on one side, whipping in the wind. Inside the bunker, the stacked firewood pressed forward. She could hear the faint scrape of bark against wood. If the stack gave way, it might jam the door open. For a split second, she imagined abandoning the bunker altogether. Let it fail. Focus on rationing what wood she already had inside the cabin. She counted in her mind. The stack by the stove might last 2 days if she burned small fires and layered blankets, but -20 degrees Fahrenheit does not forgive small fires. The stove would have to burn steady to keep pipes from freezing and the cabin livable. 2 days would not be enough. No plow would reach her in 2 days. The road was likely impassable. Emergency crews were stretched thin. She had heard enough before the radio died to know that town was struggling. She could not give up the bunker. Her thoughts shifted to something else she had built months ago without thinking much of it. Behind the cabin, near the tree line, she had stacked a small emergency pile of wood under the porch overhang. It was only a dozen logs meant for quick access during light snow. She had forgotten about it in the rush of the storm. If she could get to that pile, she could at least buy time. But reaching it meant crossing the yard again, fighting through drifts that were growing by the minute. Another heavy gust hit, and the bunker door jerked violently from her grip. The remaining screw in the top hinge ripped free. The hinge tore loose. The door twisted sideways, hanging crooked from the bottom hinge alone. Snow blasted into the opening in a thick wave. She shoved against it with all her strength, trying to force it back into place. The lower hinge shrieked, metal bending under strain. The stacked firewood inside shifted again, pressing outward. She could see it now through the widening gap. The front row of logs was tilting, no longer locked tight. Her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear the wind. This bunker had been more than a cheap structure. It had been proof that she could prepare smart, that she could solve problems with limited means. If it failed now, it would not just be wood she lost. It would be confidence. She planted her boots deep into the snow and leaned in, pushing the door back as far as she could. With one hand, she reached for the loose hinge plate and tried to press it flat against the frame. Without screws, it was useless, but maybe if she held it in place long enough to close the door fully, the pressure from the drift might help keep it sealed. Another rumble came from inside. The front stack of firewood finally gave way, logs tumbling forward against the door. The added weight shoved it outward again, widening the gap. Snow poured in. She felt it brush her wrist, icy and relentless. Her mind raced. If she ran to the cabin for tools, even for a minute, the opening would widen further. If she stayed here holding it, the cold would sap her strength until she could not feel her hands. She glanced toward the cabin once more. A faint glow flickered in the window from the wood stove inside. That warmth depended on what stood behind this failing door. The wind howled louder, as if sensing her hesitation. And then, beneath the roar of the storm and the groan of bending metal, she heard something else. A sharp cracking sound from the direction of the cabin roof. She froze, still bracing the bunker door, heart caught between two threats. Another crack followed, deeper and heavier than before. Another crack followed, deeper and heavier than before. It did not come from the bunker this time. It came from above the cabin, from the direction of the roofline where snow had been building for days. The sound was thick and sharp, like timber under strain. She stood frozen between two dangers. One hand braced against the crooked firewood bunker door. The other half raised as if she could somehow steady the air itself. The wind did not slow. It roared across the yard, pushing snow through the widening gap of the bunker. Inside, the front row of dry firewood had already shifted, pressing outward. Powder swirled into the stack, settling between the logs that had stayed bone-dry for months. Then came another sound from the cabin. A low groan, longer this time. Her chest tightened. If the cabin roof gave way under the weight of snow and ice, the wood stove inside would not matter. The heat would escape, snow would pour in. The whole fight to protect the firewood bunker would become useless in seconds. She had to choose. The bunker was her fuel. The cabin was her shelter. Another heavy gust slammed into her back, nearly throwing her off balance. The twisted door jerked in her grip. The bottom hinge shrieked, metal bending under pressure. A hard thump sounded from the roof again. She made her decision. She shoved the bunker door closed as far as she could and packed snow against the lower edge with both boots, kicking it tight in place. It was not a real fix, just a desperate brace. The fallen logs inside were still leaning, but for the moment the drift and her packed snow held the door mostly shut. Mostly, that would have to be enough. She grabbed the shovel and fought her way back toward the cabin, heart pounding. Snow slashed across her face. The yard was nearly unrecognizable now. Drifts rose in strange shapes. The wind erased everything familiar. When she reached the porch, she looked up. The roof sagged slightly along one edge where snow had built thick near the eaves. Icicles had fused into a solid ridge of ice. The weight was uneven, heavier on the side that faced the shifting wind. Another crack split the air. A narrow sheet of packed snow slid from the roof and crashed into the drift below. Not the whole roof. Not yet, but enough to send fear straight through her. She knew she could not ignore it. Snow load was no small matter. She had read about roofs collapsing in storms like this. Tin could hold a lot, but only if the weight stayed balanced. If ice blocked the natural slide of snow, pressure would build until something gave. The wood stove inside was burning steady. That heat rising toward the ceiling might be melting the lowest layer of snow just enough to create ice. The freeze and thaw cycle would lock the top layers in place. She had to clear it. But clearing a roof in -20 degrees Fahrenheit wind was no simple chore. She rushed inside for a moment to catch her breath and warm her hands by the stove. The small stack of firewood near the hearth looked suddenly fragile. Each log felt precious now. She added one carefully, watching the flame catch. The cabin creaked again overhead, no time to rest. She grabbed the long-handled rake she used in summer for the garden. It was the closest thing she had to a roof tool. Then she stepped back into the storm. The wind hit her even harder this time. It was as if the blizzard sensed her fear and pressed harder. She positioned herself near the edge of the roof and reached up with the rake, pulling at the heavy snow along the eaves. The first pull brought down a small cascade. Snow crashed around her boots. The second pull freed a larger section, which slid off in a thick slab and slammed into the drift. But the upper layers remained stuck, frozen to the ice beneath. She moved along the edge, working steadily, trying to clear enough to reduce the weight. Each pull drained her strength. The rake handle vibrated in her frozen hands. Snow fell against her shoulders and down her collar. Inside her mind, the image of the firewood bunker door remained sharp, the broken hinge, the snow pushing through the seam. Even if she saved the roof, she might still lose the dry firewood. Another deep groan rolled through the cabin. She looked up just as a larger section of snow shifted above. It did not fall fully, but it slid a few inches, settling into a new position with a heavy thud. The sound shook her. If the entire sheet let go at once, she would not have time to move. She stepped back, breathing hard. The yard looked like a white ocean, waves frozen mid-crash. The firewood bunker stood half-buried, door crooked but still in place. The path between the cabin and the bunker was nearly gone again. Her world had shrunk to two structures and the thin line of heat between them. She forced herself back to work, pull, drag, step aside. Let the snow fall. Slowly, inch by inch, more of the roof edge cleared. The tin surface peeked through in narrow strips. Snow slid more easily where she had broken the ice bond. The load lightened just enough for the groaning to ease. But the storm was far from done. The wind shifted once more, now driving straight against the side of the cabin opposite the bunker. Snow began piling along that wall, climbing higher against the boards. She knew what that meant. Drifts against walls trap moisture and add pressure. If snow rose high enough to cover the lower windows, it could block light and airflow. If it froze solid, it would press against the siding. Her breath came fast. There were too many problems and not enough time. Then she heard it again. A sharp metallic snap from the direction of the bunker. Her head turned instantly. Through the swirling white she saw the crooked door jerk violently outward. The lower hinge, the last thing holding it, twisted at an angle that did not look natural. The drift she had packed with her boots had begun to crumble under fresh wind. The door lurched. She did not think. She ran, her legs burned as she pushed through the deep snow. The rake fell from her hands behind her. The only thought in her mind was the stack of dry firewood inside that bunker. The seasoned wood she had split and stacked so carefully. The fuel that fed the wood stove. The heat that kept her alive in this -20 degrees Fahrenheit blizzard. When she reached it, the sight hit hard. The bottom hinge had half torn from the frame. The door hung at a steep angle. Snow was pouring in steadily now, filling the lower half of the bunker. The front rows of firewood had collapsed completely, logs rolling into the growing drift inside. She grabbed the door and tried to force it shut again, but the weight from both inside and outside fought her. The wood frame had warped under pressure. Inside, the once bone-dry firewood was disappearing under white. Her chest tightened with a mix of anger and fear. All those hours splitting logs in summer heat. All the careful stacking to keep airflow steady. All the thought she put into the sloped tin roof and raised platform to protect from ground moisture. $7 and months of work. The storm did not care. She shoved her arm through the opening and began dragging out logs blindly, tossing them behind her toward the cabin path. If she could not save the bunker, she would save what she could of the dry firewood before it was buried. One log, then another. The wind tore at her coat. Snow packed into her sleeves. Her fingers went numb. Behind her, the cabin groaned again, a low warning sound that carried through the storm. She glanced back just in time to see another thick slab of snow slide from the roof edge, crashing down near the porch. The structure still stood, but for how long? She turned back to the bunker and pulled harder, dragging armfuls of firewood from the collapsing stack. Some pieces were already dusted with snow. Others remained dry for now. Each trip to the cabin felt longer. She tossed the logs just inside the door, building a growing pile on the floor near the stove. The small room filled with the smell of cold wood and fresh air. Back and forth she went, fighting the wind, racing the storm. With every pass, the bunker sagged more. The door bent outward at an ugly angle. The tin roof rattled under the shifting wind. The climax was closing in. She could feel it in the way the storm pressed harder, in the way both structures groaned under weight and strain. She stepped out of the cabin once more to grab another armful. At that exact moment, a powerful gust roared down from the hills with a force she had not yet felt. It hit the bunker broadside. The remaining hinge ripped free. The door tore away completely, and the entire front wall of the firewood bunker began to fold outward into the storm. The remaining hinge ripped free. The door tore away completely, and the entire front wall of the firewood bunker began to fold outward into the storm. For a split second, she simply stared, frozen not from cold but from shock. The $7 firewood bunker that had stood through rain, sleet, and early snow was giving up in one violent motion. The stacked dry firewood inside tilted forward as the frame split apart. Snow rushed in like a living thing, swallowing the lower half of the pile. Then instinct took over. She lunged forward and grabbed as many logs as she could hold, cradling them against her chest. The wind tried to spin her around. Snow hit her face so hard it felt like sand. She stumbled toward the cabin and kicked the door open with her boot. The heat from the wood stove rolled over her as she dropped the armful onto the growing stack near the hearth. She did not pause. She went back out. The bunker was no longer a bunker. The front boards had collapsed fully, hanging at odd angles. The tin roof rattled wildly but still clung to the back supports. The once neat wall of bone-dry firewood was now half buried under snow and half exposed to the storm. She dug with bare hands now, too rushed to think about cold. She pulled logs free from the top layers that had not yet been soaked. Some were still perfectly dry, protected by the tight stacking and the roof overhang. Others were dusted but salvageable. Trip after trip she made, building a new pile inside the cabin. The small room filled with wood stacked against the wall, beside the table, near the foot of the bed. It was not neat. It did not need to be. Outside, the bunker gave one final groan and collapsed flat, the roof sliding down into the drift. Snow covered what remained in seconds. She stood there breathing hard, staring at the place where it had stood. The structure was gone. The scrap boards, the rusted hinges, the sloped tin roof she had been so proud of were now part of the snowbank. But she was still standing. She grabbed 2 more logs from the edge of the drift, the last dry ones she could reach without digging deeper into the buried pile. Then she retreated into the cabin and shut the door firmly behind her. Inside, the world felt smaller and safer. The wood stove burned steady. The flames reflected in the small window. The pile of firewood she had rescued stood taller than she expected. She crouched down and touched a piece near the top, dry, solid, good-seasoned firewood. She let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. The blizzard continued to howl outside. The roof still creaked now and then, but the worst of the weight had slid off after her clearing. The cabin held firm. She fed the stove slowly and carefully, not wasting a single log. The rescued firewood would have to last until the storm passed and the road was cleared. She calculated again in her mind. With careful burning, with steady heat instead of roaring flames, she had enough. That night felt longer than the others. She sat near the stove, wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind pound against the walls. Every sound made her look up. But there were no more sharp cracks, no violent shifts. Just the steady voice of winter doing what winter does. At some point in the early morning hours, the wind began to soften. Not completely, not suddenly, but enough that she noticed the difference. The gusts were less violent. The cabin no longer shuddered with every blast. When pale light finally filtered through the frosted window, the world outside looked still. She opened the door slowly. The yard was buried. Drifts rose nearly to the porch railing. The remains of the firewood bunker were nothing more than a low, uneven mound beneath the snow. The path she had fought so hard to clear was gone, but the sky above was clear blue. The storm had moved on. She stepped out carefully, boots sinking deep. The air was sharp and cold, but without the wind it felt almost calm. The thermometer still read below zero, though not as brutal as the -20 degrees Fahrenheit mark from the day before. She turned back to look at her cabin. The roof held, the walls stood straight. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney into the bright winter sky. That smoke felt like a quiet victory. She did not rush to dig out the buried woodpile. There would be time for that. The priority now was keeping the stove fed and the cabin warm. The dry firewood she had saved would carry her through the next couple of days. By afternoon she saw movement down the road. A plow, slow and steady, cutting through the packed snow. It took hours to reach her driveway, but when it did, she felt something inside her ease for the first time in days. The driver leaned out the window and gave a wave. She waved back. Later, a neighbor stopped by on foot, trudging through the newly cleared road. He stared at the flattened remains of her bunker and shook his head. "Storm like that'll test anything," he said. She nodded. "It did." He glanced at the smoke rising from her chimney. "You stayed warm?" "Stayed warm." He looked again at the wreckage. "Guess that little $7 firewood bunker worked as long as it could." She smiled faintly. It saved what mattered. After he left, she stood alone in the yard, looking at the broken boards half buried in snow. She did not feel foolish for building it. She did not regret the time or the effort. The bunker had done its job. It kept her firewood bone dry through months of rain and early snow. It protected her heat source long enough for her to rescue what she needed during the worst -20 degrees Fahrenheit blizzard she had ever faced. Even in its failure, it gave her time. That mattered. Over the next few days, she dug carefully through the collapsed pile, salvaging what wood she could. Some logs were soaked and would need months to dry again. Others, deeper in the stack and shielded by the roof, were still usable. She stacked the good pieces near the cabin wall to air out in the winter sun. Each board she pulled from the snow told a story. The raised platform had kept ground moisture away. The tight stacking had slowed the spread of snow inside. The sloped roof had held longer than she expected, but she also saw where it had been weak. The hinges were too light. The front frame lacked reinforcement. The windward side needed bracing against heavy drifts. She began to plan. Not out of pride this time, but out of knowledge earned. When spring came and the snow melted into muddy rivulets across the yard, she cleared the space where the bunker had stood. She laid out stronger posts, anchored deeper into the ground. She reused what scrap lumber she could, but she added thicker beams for the frame. She found sturdier hinges at the hardware store and spent a little more than $7 this time. The new firewood bunker stood taller and stronger, still simple, still practical. It kept the same raised floor and sloped tin roof design that had worked before. It allowed airflow for proper seasoning. It kept firewood dry and protected from rain and snow. But now it carried the lesson of that storm in every joint and brace. Neighbors noticed. One afternoon, the same man from the general store stopped by again. He walked around the new structure, nodding slowly. "Looks solid," he said. She brushed sawdust from her hands. "Built it better this time," he chuckled. "That blizzard got us all thinking." She looked at the cabin, at the chimney, at the quiet stretch of land that had tested her. "Storms come," she said simply. "Best to be ready." The memory of that night when the bunker collapsed never left her. The sound of hinges snapping, the sight of snow pouring into her dry firewood, the crack of the cabin roof under heavy load. Those moments stayed sharp in her mind. But so did the feeling of standing in the quiet after the storm, smoke rising steady from her chimney. She learned that preparation is not about building something that never fails. It is about building something that buys you time. The $7 firewood bunker was never meant to last forever. It was meant to protect what mattered when winter showed its worst, and it did. Years later, when another storm warning came across the radio, she stepped outside and checked the new bunker. The door shut tight, the hinges held firm. Inside, rows of seasoned firewood sat stacked neatly, dry and ready. She ran her hand across the smooth wood and felt that same quiet pride she had felt the first time. Winter would come again, blizzards would return. The temperature would drop below zero more times than she could count, but she would be ready. Because she knew now that survival in a minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit blizzard is not about luck. It is about dry firewood, a steady wood stove, a strong roof, and the will to step into the storm when everything around you shakes. The old bunker had fallen. The lesson it taught her never did.